Hi folks, this video is going to be a demo of Tony Kuyper's new selection brush plugin. As you may have noticed, I haven't been very active on YouTube for the past year, actually more like 2 years. The reason for that is I'm not getting any younger and there are only so many hours in the day and in life. So I've been prioritizing other video projects and work stuff and also trying to dedicate more time to my own personal travels and adventures. But I do still want to post videos on my YouTube channel when I have the time and I have something cool and new to show you. Tony Kuyper, on the other hand, has been as busy as ever creating all kinds of useful and fun new plugins for Photoshop. A while back, he released his Magic Mixer plugin, which is great for doing black and white conversions. He also has a free plugin that provides some different and creative methods for using Photoshop's generative fill feature. And most recently, he released his free selection brush plugin, which is what I'm going to be demoing for you today. If you don't already, make sure to follow Dave Kelly's Joy of Editing channel. In addition to my courses, his TK Friday playlist is a huge and free resource for learning how to use a lot of Tony Kuyper's tools. Okay, on to the selection brush tool, which, as I mentioned, you can get for free. It's on Tony Kuyper's website, which is goodlight.us. One of the things that I love about Photoshop is how good it is at making all different kinds of selections. Photoshop has several tools for making selections, and you can make luminosity selections, color selections, edge selections, object selections, and more. Sometimes it can be useful to paint a selection, which is how it's done using the brush tool in Lightroom. And for ages, Photoshop has also had the Quick Mask feature, which allows you to paint a selection. Some people are good at using Quick Mask and they like it, but I don't think it gets used a lot these days because it has limited functionality and it's not very intuitive. The Selection Brush plugin is designed to provide a better and easier way to do selection painting. It only does a couple of things, so it's a nice and small plugin. If you want, you can place it vertically like a toolbar, but I like to place it right up here above where I keep my multi-mask module and my histogram. In the plugin menu, there are settings for the language, selection overlay opacity, overlay color, brush settings, showing the selection indicator, and there's some links to more info and instructions. And I'll talk about some of these in more detail shortly. The interface of the plugin has just 6 buttons. The first 3 are for choosing the type of selection that you want to make. The blue button is for making a standard selection, and the other 2 allow you to combine painting with the Photoshop object selection tool to select objects. This is Photoshop's object selection tool. And you can see here that it has 2 modes. One's called rectangle mode, and the other one's called lasso mode. And in the selection brush plugin, this utilizes the rectangle mode, and this utilizes lasso mode. This button is for adding to a selection. This button is for subtracting from a selection or erasing parts of a selection. And the final button here is for canceling any brush selection that you have in progress and starting over. So now let's look at some ways that it can be used. You start by choosing which type of selection you want to make. So we're going to start with just the standard selection to begin with. And when you choose a selection type, that button is highlighted pink so you remember which one you're working with. Anytime you click one of the selection types, the plus option or the add option is what's auto-selected, so you're automatically creating or adding to a selection. Now you simply paint what it is you want to select. Let's say this area right here. The area that you paint has that pink or magenta overlay. And when you click the button a second time, that overlay is converted into a selection. And that's the basic procedure. The first click puts you into painting mode, and the second click loads what you painted as a selection. If you want to continue painting the selection, you can click the blue button again to reload the overlay, and the plus or add button is auto selected, so you can continue painting your selection. And you can do this as many times as you want, viewing the selection and clicking again to go back to the overlay. And if you end up painting somewhere that you didn't want to, like let's say out here into the sky, I can click on the subtract and size that. That's the eraser tool that gets loaded, and subtract areas of that painted selection that I didn't want to paint. Notice that in the add mode, the brush tool is selected. The color is set to magenta for the magenta overlay, and the opacity and flow and hardness of the brush are all set to 100%. But when you're done painting with the selection brush and either exit the procedure or load the selection, notice that all of your brush settings reset to whatever it was that you had them at before you used the selection brush. 100% opacity, flow, and hardness is good for painting along the edges of objects that you want to be very precise about, like the edge of the lighthouse here. But let me cancel out of this. If you did want to paint with a soft edge brush for your selection so that you would get a feathered selection instead of a hard edge selection, you can also change the opacity or the flow and also the hardness of the brush before you start painting. So for example, if I want to use a feathered brush to paint in the sky so that my selection doesn't have a hard edge, you can do that as well. To modify a selection, you always have to re-click whichever button it is that you're working with to re-enter the painting mode. And then you can select whether you're adding or subtracting. And notice that while the add button does set your opacity, flow, and hardness to 100%, the subtract button, which uses the eraser tool, does not automatically set. For example, here my hardness was set at 0 and it stays there. It doesn't set it to 100%. So these settings do not automatically change. You have to come in and modify those yourself if you want to. In the plugin menu, if you want to set a different opacity for the color overlay, you can do that here. And that will take effect the next time you create the overlay. The default of 50% or maybe 40% is what I like to use. You can also choose a different overlay color if you don't want to use the magenta color. If you don't want the plugin to automatically set your brush to 100% opacity, flow, and hardness, you can uncheck this item right here, and it will leave your brush set to whatever you had it set at. And you'll also notice that when you load a selection, there is a selection indicator around the plugin that lets you know there is a selection active. And if you don't want that indicator to show up, you can turn it off by unchecking this item right here. And again, if you want to abort a selection, like I don't want this sky selection, you use this button to get out of the process and go on to other things, or start making a new selection if you want to start over. So like we said, this standard selection tool or brush can be useful for selecting things. For example, like let's say this window. If I want to select this window and we're using that hard edge brush, I can click, and one of the cool things you can do is hold down the shift key if you've got a straight line, and that'll draw or paint a straight line along there. And then we can do multiple shift clicks along this arch to get it through there. And then I can increase my brush size and fill in the middle part of that. And now I've created a selection of the window. And that way you can make an entire selection But the standard selection brush can be useful for refining a selection that you've made some other way, where you just need to paint to refine small portions of it. For example, if we were to go to Select and Sky, or simply click the Select Sky button in the TK9 combo module, that engages Photoshop's Select Sky feature to select the sky. But sometimes Photoshop isn't exactly sure where the edge of the sky is. So if we zoom in on this, you can see that this selection is overlapping quite a ways into the lighthouse there. And it's also overlapping into the roof somewhat here and along the eaves here. And in fact, once we have this selection, even though we didn't make the selection with the selection brush tool, if I click on the standard selection tool to go back into the overlay mode, we get that color overlay of where the selection is. And I can see all these places where Photoshop overlapped where I don't want it to. And so now I can use the selection brush to work with that. So I can go to minus and use that to subtract that selection out of these areas where I don't want it. So along this edge, and I'm using a feathered brush right now to subtract because I do want this to end up being kind of a feathered selection along that edge. But let's take a look down here. I don't want that to be feathered, so I'm going to go ahead and bring up the hardness on my eraser tool and use that to fully erase that area out of the selection and along the roof line here. And this is where you can get in really close with the brush and just very carefully subtract out areas from that selection that Photoshop got wrong that we want to remove. And you could be much more careful with it than that, but you can see how we're able to work with that. And I can go back and forth, go back to the plus if I go one way too far. I want to repaint in. Oh, and you can see even that Photoshop selection is feathered out into the sky as well. So, you can decide if you want to paint that in even further. But once you're done with all that, and you click the standard selection button again, now we load that new refined or modified selection of the sky. So basically, any place where I would have used the quick mask mode in Photoshop, I now just use the selection brush plugin because I just find it so much easier and intuitive and functional. And we haven't even gotten to the object selection brushes yet, which provide more function. So let me cancel out of this selection. And now we're going to go to the rectangle object selection and use that to select the lighthouse. Now, one way that you could use this is to entirely paint over the whole lighthouse like that. And then when you click that button a second time, it loads the selection and it identifies the lighthouse as the object. So you might think you always need to paint over everything like that, but actually the way that the rectangular object selection feature works in Photoshop is it's just going to create a rectangle based on the highest and lowest and most left and right points, and then select whatever objects it finds inside that rectangular area. So if I go into rectangular object selection brush mode and create one point above the lighthouse, create another point below the lighthouse, create another point over past this edge of the lighthouse, and another point over past this edge of the lighthouse, those 4 points, it can now create a rectangle using those as the outer dimensions. And when I click this again, it'll find the object it thinks is inside that rectangle. And again, it selected the lighthouse. So that's how simple it is to make an object selection using this tool. Is just 4 clicks. 1, 2, 3, 4. Click that button again, and you get the object selection. And once you have the selection, you can go back to the blue button and click it to get the overlay. So you can see exactly where that selection is and how it looks. And if you wanted to add or subtract from that selection, you could do that. So you would get out of the overlay mode and come back to the rectangular selection mode. And let's say I wanted to add in the tree to the right with that lighthouse. So I would click that again. And now I could click 1, 2, 3, 4 around that tree. Well, make sure I got that selected in there. And then click the rectangular selection brush button again. And let's see if it'll add the tree into the selection. And it did. And we'll notice that if we go to the overlay, we can see that while it selected the tree pretty well, it still didn't get in between all the branches. So Photoshop's object selection doesn't make that well refined of selections for things like trees against the sky. But if we get out of the overlay and back to this live selection, we can still use that selection to go to select and mask if we want to. So you find that in the select menu here under select and mask, or Alt-Control-R, or in the TK plugin, it's the S&M or select and mask button. So if I click that, that'll take us in here to select and mask, and we could perhaps use something like the, let's get over here, just to start with, the refine hair option, which is in select and mask. And that may help us get a little bit closer to some of these fine branches. And then we can also use the refine selection tool and use that to paint along here. And then it magically finds all of those edges much better. And so we could continue refining that part of the selection in select and mask. And then when we were done, we would click OK. And now we'd be back here with that new refined selection. Okay, now let's look at the final selection brush option, which is the lasso version. And this works similarly, a little differently, and you'll get varying results. So what I usually do is start with this one, and if I get the result I want, great. And if not, I may bump over and try this one. It's hard to know ahead of time which of these two options is going to work better, so it's good to try them both. Now, how this one works is a little differently. You can't use the 4-point method. So I can't just do 4 points. For example, if I'd made those 4 points like I did with the rectangular mode and click again, we get nothing. It doesn't know what to select there. But what you can do is just make an outline. You can use a pretty big brush and then use the shift clicking method to just paint an outline. And as long as you overlap the boundaries of the whole lighthouse here, that should do it. You don't need to fill it in. And let's try that. And using that method, it found the lighthouse. So that's another method to try. And like I said, sometimes when one way doesn't work, the other way works better. So it's just good to experiment. And again, you can add and subtract to that lasso selection brush by re-clicking that button. And then if I want to add in the tree along with that, we can try that and see if it'll add the tree to the lighthouse. And it did. And this is useful for all kinds of objects and all kinds of selections. In this image, we just have landscape features, but I think the rectangular object selection tool is great for this. So for example, if I want to select this C stack, I could click the outer boundaries of that and select that object. And then if I also wanted to select the other C stack as well, I could click that button again and go around the outer dimensions of that one. Yeah, let's say that's good. Let's see what it finds. Yeah, so now I've added the two C stacks together. Or if I decided, actually, I want the selection just of this C stack in the background, not this one, I would go back into that rectangle selection, go to subtract, and now I could click the boundaries of this C stack and subtract that C stack from the selection. Mostly did have that little bit right there. And what's great about this is where I could go back to the standard selection brush and see where those little pink lines are, select subtract, and just paint those out where I don't want them there. And actually, let's zoom in and see. Yeah, see, I've got a little pink halo all the way along here. So that's where the standard selection brush can be really useful for refining selections that went into some areas or have some remnants in areas that you don't want them. And finally, Photoshop's object selection combined with the selection brush plugin is really great for selecting things like people and animals in your photos as well. So I've got a group of 5 of the members of Photo Cascadia here. And if I wanted to select all the people, I could come to the object selection, and let's just see if with the rectangular object selection, if it can find all 5 people. If I select outside all of them, click that again, and yes, it did a great job. It found all 5 people and selected us as a group. Or if I get out of that, so what about a single person? Could I select just one of us here? Again, with the rectangular version or rectangular mode, click on the outer edges of Erin Bobnick there. And yes, it was able to find Erin by herself. What I don't know that it can do, let's try this. Let's go back to here. I don't think it can do, I think it can either do the whole group or one person at a time. I don't know if it can find 2 people at once. Let's try that. So Adrian and Erin, let's see what it does with that. Yeah, so it just finds one. And if I want to add the second person, I would click here and add Adrian separately. Let's see, where's the bottom end of Adrian there. Let's see how that does adding. Yeah, so now we've added in Adrian. And if I wanted to add Zach in as well, or let's say not Zach, let's say if I just wanted to add David to that, I could click outside of David with 4 points and click there. And yes, now we've got David as well. And again, if there was anything missing, if I zoomed in and saw that something was missing, for example, let's go to the overlay by clicking the blue button. Yeah, there's some areas there kind of around Erin's hand that weren't perfect. I could either go in, zoom way in, and try to subtract those out, maybe with a really tiny eraser brush and just erase in there. That would be one way to work with that. Or another way would be to try to come in with the subtraction on the rectangular object brush. And let's see, I wonder if I were to subtract that area, start with that. Okay, so I've subtracted her hand. Oh, it's still not getting that little area there. Let's try adding back in. Yeah, I think this is doing as good as it's going to do right now, but it's always worth experimenting a little bit just to see what you might be able to do. Let's one more time try subtracting. If I use the object mode, and let's see if we can just subtract out that little area there. Oh yeah, that worked. So you have a lot of options for how you're refining your selections. And of course, anytime you want to do even further refining to a selection, once you have the base selection, you can always go to select and mask and further refine it using those features there. So that's my quick overview of Tony Kuyper's new selection brush plugin. I've been using it quite a bit lately, and I'm a fan of anything that gets me out of Photoshop menus and makes my workflow more creative and artistic. If you already have the selection brush plugin, I hope this has been helpful and provided you with some tips and tricks for how you might want to put it to good use. If you don't have the plugin, but you'd like to get it, like I said, it's available for free through Tony's website, which is goodlight.us, which I've also linked to in the description. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks always for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.